Hey guys, it's Miss Riggs here. This is the second lecture of the series for Chapter 14, and we've been talking about interactions within ecosystems and how organisms interact within their environment. And so we're going to finish off where we got started yesterday. So if you want to pull out your notes and start where you ended. So yesterday we talked about different interactions among species as far as competition. We talked about resources. We talked about what a habitat is versus a niche or a niche. So today we're going to finish up on those interactions and then delve a little bit deeper into what those interactions mean. So I believe we ended off on community interactions. So we talked about the difference between competition and predation. So competition is basically when two organisms are competing against each other to inhabit a certain niche or role within the environment. So competition occurs when two organisms fight for the same resources. Now these might be food resources, these might be breeding resources, so they might be the same species, then they're competing for a mate. These might be water resources, these might be habitat resources. So organisms compete for different things. They can be the same species or they can be different species, and competition happens on a regular basis. Predation is basically when one organism is going to basically eating another organism. So we'll talk a little bit more about those two. So there are two types of competition. So interspecific competition, this is competition between two different species, and they're competing for space or habitat. They have an example here of cats and dogs. I don't know if that's the best example, but I think of maybe two different types of birds two different species of birds that might want to inhabit the same species of trees within an environment. That would be interspecific competition. They're two different species, but they're competing for the same environment. There's interspecific competition. This is between the same members of the species. And these usually involve males fighting for a mate. You can see here that we have two male lions, and these lions are competing for not only a mate, but they're also competing for territory. So they're competing for their environment. Birds do the same thing. This happens a lot actually in the rainforests because they're not necessarily competing as much for food resources since there's an abundance of food and water resources, but they are competing for mates, which is why you have more colorful organisms within that rainforest, because that is their main adaptation, is to attract mates. So predation is completely different. Predation is the process by which one organism captures and feeds upon another organism. So in this picture we have a rattlesnake, and a rattlesnake could possibly be feeding on a number of things, maybe a rodent, but one organism is benefiting from feeding off of another organism. So some other community interactions that we're going to focus on in this lecture is symbiosis. So symbiosis is a broad term for any relationship where two species live closely together and interact. And these interactions might benefit one, they might benefit both, they might harm one, they might benefit one and not the other. So there's three types that we're going to talk more about. So mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Go ahead and pause this video and complete this section in your notes. This is the review of what we just talked about, and then you can come back and we'll talk more about different interactions within an ecosystem. Okay, so once you have completed that review, we're going to go deeper into symbiotic relationships. So mutualism is exactly how it sounds. It's mutual. Both organisms are going to benefit from each other. So a common example that you might see for mutualism would be maybe a honeybee and a flower. So the honeybee is going to get sweet nectar from that flower, but it's also going to carry pollen on its body for the flower to other flowers in order to pollinate those flowers. So that's a mutualistic relationship. Both of the species are benefiting from that relationship. Here they have a picture of ants and aphids. The ants are getting the sugary substance from the aphid, while the aphid receives protein or protection from predators. So a lot of times, one organism might benefit from either getting cleaned or maybe getting a food source, while the other organism might benefit for protection. Commensalism is another symbiotic relationship. This is where one organism is benefiting while the other is unaffected. So they're not being benefited or harmed. An example might be barnacles on whales is what they have here. Barnacles are basically hitching a ride on the whales. So the whales aren't receiving any sort of benefit from this relationship, but the barnacles are gathering food as the whales go through the water. So that would be a commensalism relationship. And then parasitism. So parasitism, we've all heard of a parasite. This is when one organism benefits while the other is harmed. And there's a couple of examples of parasitism or parasites. A flea on a dog might be an example. So the dog's not benefiting because the dog's actually being harmed because that flea is taking nutrients from that dog. Another example might be a tapeworm inside a body, and that tapeworm is taking the nutrients from that organism but giving nothing to that organism. And we're going to talk about a couple of different types of parasitism. So there's two examples of parasites. So ectoparasites, ecto meaning outside, endo meaning inside. So ectoparasites are going to live on the outside of an organism. So an example of these are ticks or fleas or leeches. These are all ectoparasites. They live on the outside of the organism. They attach themselves to their host. An endoparasite, remember endo meaning inside, are going to be inside of an organism. This is two common examples would be like a hookworm or a tapeworm that an organism can get by drinking water that might have these parasites in them or eating food that might have these parasites in them. So these are endoparasites. They live inside of the body. Here are some pictures of some. We have fleas and ticks and tapeworms and leeches. These are all parasites. Okay, so that is the final part of this lecture. We'll continue tomorrow with day 3. Don't forget to finish this ticket out of the door. When you're done with this, you can go ahead and work on your web quests. Remember, I did check all of the links on the web quest, so they should all work, so you might have to give it a couple of tries and make sure that you have every single letter or number correct in your search bar.